Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to a new edition of the Indian Express Explained Live, our series of online explanatory conversations with domain experts and authorities on specific subjects. I am Monojit Majumdar, editor for explanatory journalism at the Indian Express. This evening, we are talking about climate change. The threat is existential and it is universal, even though it does vary from place to place on Earth. At the same time, every country, including India, has specific national interests and concerns, which often come in the way of concerted international action. So, where do we stand now, and how do we move ahead from here onward? Is the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius realistically still alive? Can India on its own secure itself against the worst impacts of climate change? To discuss some of these questions, and I'm sure many more, we have with us this evening Mr. R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow and Program Director at the Earth Science and Climate Change at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. Mr. Rashmi, welcome to the Indian Express. We thank you for your time and we are honored to host you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rashmi was India's chief climate change negotiator at the UNFCCC for many years and occupied a central position in climate change policymaking in India, both before and after the Paris Agreement of 2015. Speaking with Mr. Rashmi will be my colleague Amitabh Sinha, who is resident editor of the Indian Express in Pune, as well as our editor for science and climate change. Amitabh is a veteran of many COPs himself, and he has been reporting on climate change for more than 15 years. Amitabh will begin with a short presentation to set the ground for this evening's discussion, after which Mr. Rashmi and he will have their conversation. That will last for about 45 minutes, after which Mr. Rashmi will take a few questions from the audience. Today's explained event is brought to you by our associate partner, Yojana IAS. My thanks to our partner, and thank you for joining us, and welcome once again. Amitabh.
Thank you, Manojit. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this explained session on climate change, the outcomes from COP26, and what to look forward to. A very warm welcome to Mr. Rashmi. Thank you, sir, for
Thank you,
agreeing to
Amitabh.
participate in this session. Uh, so, before we begin this conversation, I would like to quickly update everyone about what happened at COP26 because that will form the context of our discussions. So it's just useful uh, to for everyone to be on the same page here. So I'll have a very small, brief sort of a presentation, although the subject is very vast. So I'll try to make it up quickly. So, as you might have followed, all of you, the Glasgow meeting, also known as COP26. So, this happened to be the 26th session of the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Framework Convention was an outcome of the famous 1992 Rio Summit, which I'm sure a lot of people would be familiar with. And from 1995 onwards, the parties to this convention, the UNFCCC, have been meeting every year, somewhere during the end of the year. So this was the 26th meeting. That's why COP26. And as all of you would be aware, the 21st meeting of this, or COP21, which was held in Paris in 2015, that produced the Paris Agreement, right? So that we keep hearing about. Now, very briefly, the main objective of Paris Agreement is to keep the global average temperatures from going beyond 2 degrees centigrade from the pre-industrial times. So that's the main objective. But at the same time, it also asks countries to keep pursuing efforts to limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade only. So these are the two temperature targets that we keep hearing about: the 2-degree target or the 1.5-degree target. Right. So now, as all of you are aware, this a climate change, an international climate change agreement is already in place. I mean, the Paris Agreement has already been negotiated, it's already there. Now, so why are we having these climate meetings still? What is still being negotiated? What is there to be discussed at these climate meetings now? So, a couple of things on that. One, of course, the fight on climate change, the fight against climate change, is a dynamic fight. You know, we need to continuously keep updating the actions that are taken on climate change. A lot of those things, are negotiated decisions. So, therefore, these climate meetings are still relevant. Also, at the same time, there are a lot of details about the Paris Agreement itself, which are still to be worked out. They were not finalized. So actually, one of the main agendas of COP26 was to finalize what are known as rules and procedures for the implementation of Paris Agreement. So, what are these rules and procedures? They are may very similar to the subordinate legislation that we have in our country. You know, the Parliament enacts a law, and then after that, it's the government which frames the rules for how that law would be executed, and then smaller things, the smaller details about that law are put in that rules. Things about, like, if that law has to be is to be executed through a newly created institution, then what the structure of that institution would be, what would be the roles and function of the officers who would be manning that institution, where would that institution be located. So those kind of things are put in the rules, and the rules that are framed for that law. Similarly, for Paris Agreement as well, there are rules and procedures that need to be framed for implementation of the Paris Agreement, right? So these rules were supposed to be finalized in 2018 itself, but a uh, lot of the provisions in these rules and procedures as well, they require a lot of negotiations. So that's why a lot of it had not been finalized in 2018, and they were left for Glasgow to complete it. You know, Also in the run up to COP26, we saw there was a lot of talk about increasing the ambition of climate change. The impacts of climate change are already being experienced. Climate change is already here, and the impacts are like successively getting worse. So there is this argument that the 2-degree target that the Paris Agreement talks about is actually no longer good enough, and that the world should actually be aiming for a 1.5, no, achieving 1.5-degree target. So a lot of mainly developed countries were using this argument to ask all the other countries to start taking enhanced actions on climate change. And this argument was getting manifested into calls for agreeing for a net zero target for all countries somewhere around the middle of the century, also for revision of NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, which is just a fancy name for climate action plans of each and every country. So we saw all that being talked about, and they became part of the agenda of COP26. But there was a spoiler as well in the run up to COP26. Uh, Developed countries said they would not be able to deliver on their long-standing promise of mobilizing at least $100 billion in climate finance by uh, 2020. This sum of money they had promised to mobilize every year from the year 2020, and this money was, this is meant to help the developing countries and the poorer countries to deal with climate change. This is uh, part of the obligation of the developed countries. It's not a charity that they are doing, but it's part of their commitment, the part of their obligation to do so. And the deadline for that was 2020, and the developed countries said they won't be able to do it by 2020. They were falling short, and they would be able to mobilize this money only from 2023 onwards. So that was a spoiler that happened before uh, the COP even started. So, what was achieved at COP26. So usually these COPs, deliver a set of decisions. There are several decisions that are mutually agreed, by consensus by all the parties. The set of decisions that were agreed at Glasgow came to be known as the Glasgow Climate Pact. Uh, and as mentioned earlier, the rule book was finalized. Then countries were asked to enhance their climate targets by a factor. Also, countries were asked to at least double their contribution for adaptation finance. And it was also agreed to set in motion a process to finalize the new target for climate finance for developed countries beyond the 100 billion US dollars. That's the current target, which has still not been met. So these were some of the important decisions. Of course, there are lots of other uh, decisions that were also taken, which became part of the Glasgow Climate Pact. So if you've not been following the climate negotiations very closely, these set of decisions probably would not seem very impressive. They look more in the nature of procedural things. Uh, but these are essentially the kind of outcomes that come out of every COP. Most of the COPs deliver these kind of decisions, and most of the progress that is made at COPs is incremental, like the one that was delivered at Glasgow as well. Uh, but there were some other, probably if you were following it, then you would have heard some other uh, decisions also, and they seemed much more, significant, at least from the perspective of news. They made big headlines, uh, even though they are not part of the COP process, in the sense that these are not negotiated decisions that happened. These were decisions announced by a set of countries which uh, you know which came together. They were all at the COP, and some like-minded countries, or some countries which had similar positions on certain issues, they came together and they made a few announcements. So one of the major announcements was regarding methane emission cuts. So over 100 countries pledged to cut their methane emissions by 30% by 2030 from the present levels. Methane, as you might be knowing, is one of the most dangerous greenhouse gases, second only to carbon dioxide in terms of abundance. Another set of 100 countries, they came together and pledged to arrest and reverse deforestation by 2030. Uh, a set of 30 countries promised to work towards 100% transition to electric vehicles by 2040. So these were some of the other decisions, more significant ones, that were announced at COP. They were not part of the COP decisions. They did not become part of the Glasgow Pact, but because they happened at COP, so maybe they become part of the COP outcome. You can see them as part of the COP26 outcomes. And then you would have also heard about India's promises. The big one, which made a lot of headlines, was a commitment to achieve net zero status by 2070. Then there were a few other announcements. Uh, at least two of promises were an enhancement of the targets that we already have, and there were two new announcements which were very much related to our earlier announcements. So this is what India did. So broadly, this is what was achieved at COP26. And now we'll start the conversation with Mr. Rashmi from here. Sir, this being the broad outcome, in very brief terms, still took a lot of time. But then, if this was the broad outcome, how do you see, the progress that was made at COP26? A lot was expected from COP26. This was supposed to put the world on a path 1.5-degree target. Uh, did we take a significant enough step at COP26 in that direction?
Thank you, Amitabh, first of all, for having me on your show. Uh, I feel that COP26 was a big opportunity for the world to move towards the objective of climate stabilization. Uh, so COP26 did achieve a large number of things, but I generally look at it as a case of missed opportunity. Before COP26, there was a lot of global expectation that the NDCs will be revised. As you have mentioned in your slides, the three things which were critical for COP26 to succeed were raising ambition, the NDC revision, and I would say not just revision, but its enhancement. And secondly, of course, you have included net zero goal, which is essentially a long-term goal for climate stabilization. So all these three things were important. It has achieved something on the process part, on the procedures part, but the larger goal of climate stabilization, I think we haven't made much stride in this direction at this COP. And I will explain in a short while why we haven't, I feel so. Looking at the overall picture, I think it's a mixed bag of partial successes and some disappointments. First, the positives. Let me explain where it has succeeded. It has succeeded in two very important areas. Is that it has been able to clinch the rules for the carbon markets. The carbon market rules were pending for a long time since Katowice, since COP24, and they were part of the Paris rulebook, which you have referred to. So the Paris rulebook had two missing elements. It could not be closed at Katowice, and one of the missing elements was carbon market rules under Article 6. The other missing element was the transparency arrangements where people had to decide on the common reporting, the common reporting tables, the way in which the reports of the inventories and the adjustments to inventories, the corresponding adjustments, adjustments in the inventories because of traded actions will take place. So transparency rules and the carbon market rules have been finalized at this COP. And I must compliment the COP presidency for having achieved this. This is a very large, because carbon markets are extremely important. I do see them as extremely important part of global climate financing. Although developed countries may not look at it that way. But right. I do think that this has an important role to play. But I'll come to that separately. But where the COP26 faltered was in its primary goal of raising the ambition of the countries in terms of 2030 goals. If you remember, the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. And in the Paris Agreement, it is recorded that in the year 2021, this is the first year of Paris Agreement implementation. So in a sense, I would have treated a COP26 as an implementation COP. A COP where implementation of the Paris Agreement starts. And how do you start implementing it? By having ambitious NDCs. NDCs which were put out by the countries in 2015 and 2016 are no longer relevant because we have now started moving towards the 1.5 degree climate stabilization goal as opposed to 2-degree goal that had been agreed earlier. 2-degree goal has not been done away with. Let me mention that. That is still there as part of our objective, but it has now been sharpened. The goal has been stiffened a little bit because of the climate emergency, because of the need to raise the global ambition, and the way the emissions are rising, we must control them. We must be able to put a stop to the way the emissions are growing. Otherwise, the future is extremely dark. So we have to move ambitiously in that direction, and that is where I think this COP could not do much. It set its goal, unfortunately, on a long-term goal. Yeah. 1.5 degrees is a long-term goal, and net zero goal is a long-term goal. It will take another 40 years and 50 years maybe for some countries to move towards that goal. But the immediate requirement was to have ambitious NDCs, 2030 goals, and those short-term goals were given a short shrift, if I may use that term. The other thing which you have yourself referred to was lack of clear commitment on finance, which has been a major irritant with or very large issue with most of the countries that are vulnerable to climate change. The Africa was exercised over this issue. In fact, at some point of time, they were willing to dig in their heels and not let this issue go away. But everyone realized that in the interest of a balanced outcome at the COP, we need to move forward and let all the stakeholders go forward. So there was a decision, but this decision is only notional. They have admitted that they have failed on the climate finance front. They were not able to provide enough. Meet their goal of $100 billion by 2020, but they have started a process. So at COP26, at best, we have started the process, and one doesn't know whether we see the light at the end of the tunnel in 2025, which is the year by which we are supposed to agree to a new quantified long-term goal for finance. And the last thing which I will mention, why I felt a little disappointed, was on the issue of technology. All the climate watchers have felt that the technology piece was completely missing from the debate and the dialogue at COP26. But I consider this as crucial. If we really want to have a transformative climate action in the short term, technology is really the critical piece, and we must do everything possible to promote transformative technologies, create necessary platforms, finance the deployment of the technologies that are available, and support the development of technologies which are required. So I think this is broadly what I feel was the general the way in which I could like to summarize the COP26 outcomes.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Rashmi. I think you also made a distinction between the long-term strategies and the things that we need to do in the near term. The 2030 targets, the 2025 targets, and one of the countries that had you know a, a significant contribution in terms of having near-term targets was India, wherein four of the five things that we announced, of course, not all of that was new, but except for the net zero target, all our targets are near-term targets, 2030. Uh, how do you see India's own commitments that were announced? If we leave aside the 2030, the net zero target for the time being, I mean, I'll come back to that in a second. But the 2030 targets often, uh, you know, there are two schools of thought generally, which view very differently the way India has taken that target. One, of course, says these targets are easily achievable, and probably India would achieve them even in the business as usual scenario. Our targets on renewables, our targets on emissions intensity. Uh, there is another school of thought which says it's not going to be achieved in business as usual scenario. In fact, India will have to make a very concerted effort, uh, especially after it has enhanced its targets, to be able to achieve those targets by the 2030 targets. How do you see those India's performance on those targets?
My answer will be a mixed bag of yes and no.
Yeah.
Some elements out of these five major announcements made by the Prime Minister at Glasgow are easily achievable. And for example, the 1,000 million tons reduction by 2030, that's something which is achievable. And it's going to happen because of a number of specific dedicated programs. He mentioned about LED program, for example. He also mentioned about the electrification, which is going on in the Indian Railways. So if we look at some of the focused programs for energy savings, energy efficiency, and energy transition, it's possible to achieve reduction in absolute terms of 1,000 million tons by 2030. But that doesn't mean that our total emissions will be less than as of now. It will only mean that we will be increasingly reducing the proportion of energy and emissions saved in 2030. Today, our emissions are in the range of 2,800 million tons, if you include the carbon sinks. And our energy consumption is growing. So we are going to land up anywhere in the range of 3 or 3.5 or 4,000 million tons 2030. But in the BAU scenario, business as usual scenario, this would have been much higher.
Right.
That is what the Prime Minister has mentioned. So that is first part. And the second easier part, or not easier, but another easy part is the emissions intensity target, which is currently 35%. He has now raised it to 45% emissions intensity reduction by 2030 compared to GDP. Going by the current trends, it looks like it is doable. It is we are going to achieve this. But I also have certain reservations, just like other people have, that while it may be easy to achieve it by 2030, beyond 2030, I do see a problem in continuing this emissions intensity reduction, because currently we are achieving this reduction only on the back of energy efficiency improvements. But very soon we are likely to hit a wall if we don't reduce the carbon intensity in the industrial sector,
right,
and in the transport sector, which are the growing sectors, and in the infrastructure sector. These are the sectors which are extremely carbon intensive. They are not simply energy intensive, they are carbon intensive. For example, steel and cement industry. They use coal not only for meeting their energy needs, but for actually producing the products. So the products themselves are carbon. They use coking coal for producing steel. Cement industry also uses coal. So in pharmaceuticals, chemicals, these are extremely heat intensive industries. So for producing heat, they use it. So I do see a problem in continuing this trend if we don't introduce new technologies in these industries to reduce the carbon intensity and switch over to other sources of energy or other sources of heat. That is what is going to bother us, and currently we don't see light here. So that is the second point. Now, he also mentioned about the third, which is the most talked about thing, was the 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. Right. And that is linked to the other interpretation which he has given, is that by 2030 we will have 50% of our energy
from renewable
capacity or generation from renewable energy. Now, this is again, you can take any view. Some people say that if you look at capacity, I think 50% of energy capacity is possible. Currently, we have reached a point of 100 gigawatts or 105 gigawatts of renewable capacity, if you include all small hydro, solar, wind together. But the difficult part is that from 100 gigawatts today, we have to now move to 500 gigawatts by 2030. So almost a five times jump in the next 9 years. That's a huge, stupendous target. So if and that requires a huge investment, not only investment but also large institutional change in our energy production and consumption system. We have to include all our states in this. They have to be a part of the kind of changes that will take place in the energy pricing policy, in the distribution policy. The distribution companies will have to be overhauled for to be able to this. And then perhaps we will have to use different instruments altogether, financial instruments, to be able to mobilize investment at this scale. So that is really challenging. But once we are able to set up a 500 gigawatt capacity, I think even 50% of generation is also doable. If you compare it with the peak demand today, the peak demand is in the range of 180 to 200 megawatts. So if you have 500 megawatts of capacity set up in 2030, I think
you mean gigawatts, sir?
Gigawatts. I'm sorry, gigawatts. It's possible to meet even 50% of generation by that level. So that is the other element in the five things which he announced. And net zero goal by 2070. I think it's a long-term goal. It's difficult to assess its full implication at this stage. Of course, this is something which is part of a long-term strategy which many countries are building up. And I think he has rightly set a goal for India. Whether it is feasible, implementable, that depends on a number of things. But only the future will be able to tell us.
On net zero, actually, I had another question as well. The How much do you think uh, this net zero announcement by India uh, is a response to the international demand that was being put on India? And we were almost like getting isolated by not announcing a net zero. So, how much of that might have played a role, and how much of this is actually dictated by a national interest, wherein we say, look, I think we probably by 2070 we will reach net zero in any case, and it is in our national and economic interest to be achieving net zero by at least that time frame. So, how much of that would have played a role in making this announcement in COP26?
Well, I'm not sure what is the government thinking on this, but I'll give you my perspective on this. I think there are two aspects to net zero goal. Net zero goal is in any case a long-term goal.
Yeah,
But any long-term goal has two aspects. One is its implementability, feasibility,
yeah,
and the other is consistency with Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC.
right,
Now, if you look at the consistency with the UNFCCC, there is a division there. The UNFCCC nor the Paris Agreement, none of these two require developing countries to have a net zero goal.
yeah,
They require net zero goal, I would say, net zero requirement for the developed countries.
right,
So that is a legal position.
yeah,
But being a progressive country, being a country which has set very high ambition for climate change, I think India also participated in this process, which is the spirit of the Paris Agreement.
mm,
All countries are voluntarily going to raise their ambition, and I think the India's Prime Minister also did that in that spirit. So I would compliment him for uh, 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 putting his best foot forward there. In a way, he was responding to both to global expectations, as also he was raising the ambition for it. So on both counts, this is fine. But the other part, which is a more difficult part, is the feasibility. Now, that is the critical part is what kind of strategy you will need to adopt to move towards this net zero goal. And unfortunately, you will notice that all the developed countries which have come up with a net zero goal in the run up to COP26, none of them have actually laid out their emissions trajectory. The
right,
pathway by which they will
yeah,
reach the net zero goal, nobody has spelled it out.
yeah,
So India alone cannot be faulted for not having a strategy for net zero goal, even if
yeah,
it has announced 2070 goal. India is in fact not required, but India
yeah,
has done so. But the larger countries, the developed countries, which were supposed to peak in 1990, if you look at the legal obligation of these
yeah,
countries, they were supposed to have peaked their emissions in 1990 and brought their emissions down to zero maybe by 2030.
exactly,
So instead of having a net zero goal for 2030, they have put out a goal for 2050, but without a strategy.
yeah.
So that is the most worrying part in this entire debate on around 2050 or 2070 goal.
So, I wanted to also raise that question, uh, which created a lot of gave a lot of bad press to India in on the last couple of days. The thing about coal, wherein a mention of phasing out of coal in the final decision text was changed to phase down. At the instance of India, China, and some other countries, though India became face of it by proposing the amendment. Uh, Now, in the past, we have always been maintaining that coal uh, would continue to support our electricity generation program for the foreseeable future at least. And sometimes that foreseeable future is uh, talked in terms of a couple of decades, sometimes even 3 or 4 decades. uh, and at other times we have also hinted that probably we would start to do away with coal relatively uh, fairly quickly in probably in a 1 decade or 1.5 decades from now. We'll at least start phasing it out slowly. So this language, the fight that we fought over uh, changing this language from phase out to phase down, how significant it is, how what difference does it make to our own plans?
Well, this phase down, phase out debate, I think, was unfortunate. Uh, and at COP26, this was an issue which was taken out of the entire context and blown out of proportions. Because I look at coal as one of the elements of the fossil fuel
Yeah.
consumption. But singling out coal for advanced phase out was rather unexpected. And I didn't. This had been discussed in G20 before COP26 only a few days ago, and
Yeah.
G20 had not been able to come to reach an agreement on this. So it was a rather, I would say, unfair on the part of the developed country partners to push for a coal phase out and use coal as the only bad boy in the whole game. We are actually looking at fossil fuel elimination.
Yeah.
We are looking at the process of decarbonization, and India, I think, did well to dig its heels and fight for a phase down rather than phase out, because coal today is almost 65% of its energy production.
Mm.
The energy requirement is met by coal today.
Yeah.
And if you look at the primary energy, it's still higher. The fossil fuels, and including coal, is
Yeah.
almost 72%. So, expecting countries like India, which depend on coal and which do not have access to alternative energy sources in the near future, to expect them to march step in step with the developed world for its phase out was a little unfair. Because
Yeah.
if you see in the debate around G20 meeting, was that the developed countries should phase out coal by 2030 or latest by 2035. Now,
Yeah.
can India phase out coal by 2035? Obviously, it's impractical and impolitic to expect this to happen. But this was the language. Therefore, I think it was well within its rights of India to fight for a coal phase down rather than phase out. And phase down will take over a period of time. So the undifferentiated time frame to which India was being put to in terms of decline in the use of coal was the real issue. And I think India did well there. The other aspect I must point your attention to was that just before this, you must have noticed there was a bilateral deal between US and
Yeah.
China.
Mm.
And China has agreed to phase down its coal consumption, not phase out.
Phase
So
out.
why was India being singled out for this? I am not able to understand. So if you look at the way the India's energy system is functioning at the moment, coal is a part of India's energy production and consumption system, and coal will decline over a period of time, no doubt. The way we are making energy transition in terms of uptake of solar energy and our coal dependence of on in power sector has almost remained static in the last 5 years. I
Right.
mean, the share of coal in total energy production is not rising after 2015.
Yeah.
In absolute terms, it might rise because our energy needs are rising, but coal will decline over a period of time. The issue that we have to struggle with is when coal can peak.
Right.
Can our existing energies or future energies enable us, technologies enable us to do that peaking earlier? That is the central question, not the phase out.
Right. So, with the targeting of coal, actually, by the developed countries, mainly, as you also pointed out, is is actually not an isolated event. No, it's part of a pattern wherein there is this systemic effort that has been going on for several years now to change the goalposts somehow, dilute the basic differentiation that exists. And you also pointed to that, undifferentiated time frames that have been put forward, not just in terms of coal, but also we see in net zero, for example, wherein all countries are supposed to go net zero by 2050. That's the demand, at least. So that sort of undifferentiated uh, time frames being imposed on developing countries, uh, that is making a lot of developing countries very angry, isn't it? So especially when the developed countries themselves have not been fulfilling their own commitments. And the classic case was their failure to put together the $100 billion, a promise that was made way back in 2009. Even though the fact that this $100 billion now for all the transitions that have to be made. So, you know, and the developed countries, also the fact that a lot of them have not fulfilled their uh, emission reduction targets under Kyoto. To lots of them walked out of Kyoto protocol. So on the one hand, we see that even their basic commitments, a lot of those countries are not meeting, and at the same time, trying to impose targets uh, on developing countries which are not uh, you know obligated to do so, or which are not required under the international law to do so. So is that creating a lot of friction, and wherein we are not seeing the kind of ambition that is required by the world as a whole?
Absolutely, you are absolutely right. The Paris Agreement or these international treaties on climate change, they they succeed only if there is trust between the parties. And so it is an issue of international cooperation. Climate change is a global problem and it can be resolved only through international cooperation. So the elements of international cooperation are built on support to developing countries in terms of technology and finance. Prior to Paris Agreement, the world was divided completely in developed and developing world. But it's no longer so. After the Paris Agreement, all countries of the world have universally agreed to raise their ambition and make voluntary contribution to the issue of carbon emissions reduction and adaptation to climate change on their own with their own resources to the extent possible, but they can raise their ambition further if international support is available. So that is where the international climate finance question comes in. That ambitions can be raised if there is certain degree of assured, predictable climate finance available from developed country quarters, and it's a legal obligation. In the industrialized 38 countries which are mentioned in the UNFCCC have a legal responsibility to provide climate finance, and it can come from both public sources as well as private sources. I, for one, do not think that all of this will come from public finance, but we must make efforts at the global level to see that the scale of this finance goes up in predictable terms from all possible sources. And the nature of this climate finance must be conceptual. These are the two fundamental characteristics. Unfortunately, this hasn't happened. The OECD claims that they have provided almost 75 to 80 billion dollars so far, but none of the developing countries agrees with this figure. They say India itself has Ministry of Finance has put out a report debunking this claim. So the reason why the developing countries are dissatisfied is that the finance that is available is not available at the scale at which it is required. It is not predictable at all. It is completely subject to the discretion of the donor countries. And thirdly, the cost of capital is high. I mean, you can't treat climate finance at par with the normal commercial capital. We all, the international market, capital market is flush with money. But that is of no use to, as far as climate change is concerned, because the developing countries need this at a concessional scale. So the critical question, I think, in my view, is not only just to raise the quantum of finance that is available within the legal system, but also to ensure that we have adequate instruments to bring down the cost of this finance.
Right.
A country like India, which has to set up 500 gigawatt of energy generation capacity from renewables by 2030, will not be able to do it alone. It will need international capital, but a capital at a cost which is lower than market cost. And so, therefore, we have to find innovative ways of meeting our hedging costs, meeting our the costs of unpredictability. The market costs of capital need to be brought down. What kind of global instruments we can evolve? I think the parties at COP26 decided to have a dialogue on this. I think in this dialogue, we should look at ways in which we can redesign the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, which we have set up. I think this model has failed, in my view. We need to innovate. And I think the way in which we can do this at the same while providing concessional finance to the developing countries is to follow the Montreal Protocol model on elimination of ODS. They have a fund, multilateral fund, which is contributed again by developed countries, but it has acted marvelously. It has is one of the most successful treaties, environmental treaties, where it has actually helped the industry make a transition away from ODS to non-ODS substances. We need to follow that model of financing the incremental cost of capital in a concessional manner to those industries which are able to show carbon reduction in a specific form. So we can link it to the outcomes. So we will have to innovate on these two fronts.
And so this lack of lack of international support to developing countries, and also the lack of more ambitious uh, emission reduction targets from the developed countries, mainly in the fact that they have not even fulfilled their relatively milder targets earlier. Is this leading us to some sort of a predicament wherein uh, countries which need international support, for example, and have limited resources, uh, are they wanting to then, would they be motivated then to utilize those resources mostly on adaptation methods or adaptation uses rather than on mitigation? Because adaptation has immediate as well as local benefits to the country concerned. So if I do something to adapt the country towards cyclones or flooding events, it is that particular country which gets immediate benefits, whereas whatever action that you take on mitigation front in trying to reduce the emissions, you don't get local benefits. The benefits are global. Everyone benefits from it. Now, because countries are more concerned about themselves, and that's very natural, you have to act in self-interest. Is this leading more and more countries to actually focus on adaptation rather than on mitigation? And that would produce another sort of uh, you know uh, that's getting into a vicious cycle, because once you don't do mitigation, even the small incremental things that even developing countries or poorer countries can do, that also means that we are letting the global warming go further, letting the temperatures rise even further, and therefore intensifying the impacts of climate change even further. So, is that the predicament that is now faced by the world?
Very right. You have touched upon an extremely important issue. I think this entire discourse on climate change, we often forget the central importance of adaptation or climate resilience, which is the immediate requirement of most of the developing countries. Climate change being a global problem, it can be resolved through global climate emissions reduction. It's one of the solutions. But the problem before most of the vulnerable countries is to ensure that the adverse impacts of climate change are addressed. We are facing the extreme heat waves, the variability in the climate, the coastal flooding. We are seeing floods. We are seeing landslides because of the erratic weathers. We are seeing cyclones. So we have to actually deal with these losses and damages and these extreme weather events on a daily basis. We have to ensure that our agricultural productivity, water availability doesn't get affected by climate change. So indeed, the resources of the countries have to be devoted first to addressing climate change by improving adaptation, by improving climate resilience. It's extremely important, and that is why the when we were talking of finance, we missed that piece of how global climate finance can be raised to meet adaptation needs. Unfortunately, you can't build commercial models or economically viable models for meeting adaptation needs. There are no projects of that nature. For emission reduction, you can have a commercial project. For adaptation, you can't have. So that is the conundrum which you face at the global level. But at the local level, you are absolutely right. The countries the immediate need is to adapt to climate change, and we need to find resources for that. The immediate benefits are seen in adaptation. Uh, Mitigation, the carbon emissions reduction will take their own time, 20 years, 30 years for the impacts to be visible. So that is indeed a question. How governments mobilize resources for adaptation is a question. But I think the general consensus is that this has to become a part of your developmental policy.
Policy.
Adaptation and climate resilience has to be ingrained into our normal developmental policies. They have to be mainstreamed so that we don't have to mobilize separate resources. We have to raise our standards of building infrastructure. For example, infrastructure itself has to become climate resilient so that we don't have to spend another lot of money on repairing it from the damages.
Yeah.
So damages must be minimized by optimizing the standards. In terms of infrastructure, in terms of improvement of our agricultural methods, and let's say, for example, the cropping pattern. For example, we use in the rice cultivation, we have methane emissions, but that's fertilizer application is important for raising our productivity. So why can't we have a good deal of research in drought-resistant crops or crops that use less water to
Right. Just let's wait for 2 minutes before Mr. Rashmi comes back. Uh, uh, are you back, sir?
I think sir is connecting the audio.
Yeah. Yeah, he's back.
Can you hear me, Amitabh?
Yes, 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 sir.
I'm sorry, I
No worries.
was blanked out because of some disruption in the supply here. Uh,
No worries, sir.
so we were talking about improving the agricultural
Yeah,
productivity and improving our the availability of water as
yeah,
part of our climate management strategy, and that's indeed extremely critical. So I'll agree with you entirely that adaptation is the more critical and more emergent requirement for the developing countries, and we will have to find ways of uh, devoting our resources. And one way is to use optimize our resources is to mainstream adaptation as part of our development strategy.
right. Thank you, sir. I think now we'll just throw open the session to our audience as well. And we'll take a few audience questions. The first one, I would invite Anshum Sharma to please go ahead and ask his question. Is Anshum there?
Hi, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sir, I would like Rashmi sir to elaborate on global vehicular emissions, as this sector contributes about a quarter of global emissions. And also, if we talk about the developed countries, China, US, Japan, these three countries, they itself contribute 50% of, they hold the share of 50% of global automobile market.
Hmm.
So, what can we do in order to have some more development in particular this vehicular emissions as the problem?
Yeah, I think as this question is valid not only for automobile sector, but also for other sectors of economy. That we need to differentiate in the strategy at the global level and at the national level. At the global level, I mean, India hardly has any large market share in automobiles, but its vehicle intensity is rising. Therefore, it will certainly need to do something about vehicular emissions. Now, the transport emissions in India is around 13 to 14% of its total inventory. Uh, so it's not very large, but it is extremely important because it's giving rise to pollution as well. So there are other environmental questions in terms of resource use. It's a highly resource intensive industry as well. It requires a lot of materials of different kinds, in addition to contributing to carbon emissions. So we'll need to look at the automobile sector and the transport sector from that point of view. What is it that we can do? At least nationally, again, we need to make a distinction between the long distance transport and the short distance transport in terms of both two wheelers, three wheelers, and four wheelers. As far as two and three wheelers are concerned, I think our data shows that industry has taken very well to electric batteries. So electric battery transition in these two-wheeler and three-wheeler market has become is taking place very positively. Can we replicate this model in four-wheeler sector? The data is mixed there. There is no doubt that we need to bring in electric vehicles at a large scale in the four-wheeler sector for passenger transport, but the strategy will need to be a little different. We can't have a target of overnight transition to electric vehicles in a matter of 5 to 6 years, or even by 2030. We'll need to adopt a step approach there so that we have hybrid vehicles. That is what our modeling shows. That will be perhaps much more effective in terms of market adoption as well as the emission reduction. And long distance trucking is transport is a different ballgame altogether. So there we will need not only we will need to bring in new technologies, new sources of energy there, because we can't rely entirely on electric batteries unless we change the battery ecosystem itself. If the batteries become much more efficient, if we change their chemicals, maybe we can think of that. But at this moment, I think unless we move towards green hydrogen, or large biofuel production, we will not be able to reduce emissions in the transport sector.
Right. Thank you, sir. The next question from the audience is from Sumit Ghosh. Sumit, please go ahead and ask your question.
Good evening, sirs. Am I audible?
Yes, please.
So my question is a bit longish. It is like this. A comprehensive action plan on our part, I mean on India's part, must envisage the loss given. But are we the Indians prepared enough and
Sumit, there
committed
was
to
a problem in
implement
your audio in between. Can you please repeat your question and be as brief as possible?
Sir, my point is a comprehensive action plan must envisage the solutions for the long term.
Yeah.
Are we Indians prepared enough and committed to implement the same? As also, shall our politicians allow us to, or rather, they will be ready to face the audit of the entire processes and activities under this plan? Because two things are concomitant. One is climate has no boundary. If stubble is burned in an area, then the wind carries it to the adjacent places. Many such similar examples are there, and we are getting impacted for no fault of our own. It comes from other sides. So many examples are there. So it is like this, that we, being the less developed countries, are sometimes penalized or victimized for the past centuries post-industrial development in the West. And now we are being taken as the victim kind of thing. So how much it is really possible, how much we should go energy that was it's the primary thing. We cannot afford to lose it like this. At the same time, we are trying. But since my childhood days, we have been listening to tidal energy, tidal wave energy, wind energy. How much we have done towards that? This is all my honest, humble submission to the policy planners, policy makers. Let's do something so that we can leave something for the progeny. Yes, thank you, sir.
Sumit, your main question is it that is the Indian political class willing to take long-term decisions, long-term view of the climate problem? Is that what you're trying to ask?
Exactly, sir.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to make sense of what the question is. If it's a question, if your question is about the political commitment, I think the answer is very simple. The Prime Minister's announcement about 2070 net zero goal for India itself sets a goal. It's a very ambitious goal, which means that India is now committed to decarbonize its economic system in a manner that it achieves net zero goal by 2070. We have about 50 years to go from now. So in 50 years, we have to make this transition. And this transition will take place not just in the energy sector. It will have to take place also in the transport sector, in the agriculture sector, because all these sectors contribute a large quantum of emissions. Agriculture is for almost 16 to 18%. Transport is 14%. The industry contributes another almost 25%. The power sector is alone about 60%. So all these sectors will have to be covered in an economic transition over a period of time. But I think as far as political commitment is concerned, we have India has demonstrated that it is fully committed. The NDC goals by 2030 are extremely ambitious. The world, in fact, rates India as one of the leading countries. Amongst the G20 countries, India has shown a very high ambition level, and it has also shown positive progress on that. So I think there should be no doubt on that score. But the problem is what Amitabh was referring to in terms of resources for adaptation. The large population is vulnerable, and that is the largest segment of population that is vulnerable is the poorer population of the country. What do they do? How do they fend for themselves? They need immediate changes in the other segments of economy. They are dependent on agriculture. They are looking for clean water. They are looking for clean air. So we need to do something in our development strategy that provides them these environmental benefits in the immediate term. And that is the real challenge. But I think you also refer to technologies. I think as far as power sector is concerned, we are using solar technology to a very large extent. Fortunately, the cost of solar energy has fallen, so it's now within our reach. It is comparable with coal-fired power, and then the way the solar energy is being ingrained into our grid system, I think we should be able to meet the 50% energy goal which Prime Minister has set.
Right. Now I invite Mr. Binoj Kutti to ask his question. Binoj?
Good evening. I hope I'm audible. Yeah.
Yes,
So
please.
my original question has been already answered in your discussion. Kind of, it was regarding adaptation and mitigation.
Right.
So I have just a small alternate question. Is now given that our emission targets are not going to be met as per the COP26 deliverables. So should the Sustainable Development Goals SDG 30s be also realigned now, or what kind of changes are anticipated in that? Thank you.
Sorry, Binoj, whose emission reduction targets are not going to be met?
I cannot hear you also.
Okay. I think Mr. Rashmi will answer the question on SDGs. I think that's more relevant.
Okay. Yeah, I think the climate, the emission reduction targets or the climate change related targets are not independent. They are part of SDGs. SDG has 17 goals, and climate change is one of them. The goal number 13 and 14, they are related to climate change. So in a way, when we move towards SDGs, we are also moving towards achieving climate change goals. At COP26, we were addressing the climate change issue very specifically under an international treaty. Uh, there is no doubt that the world as a whole has not moved ambitiously enough. The global emissions are still rising, unfortunately. They are not declining the way they should as per the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. And then the responsibility now lies with everyone. Uh, so India is playing its own role, being a developing country. Its energy needs are still rising, but it has decided to bring down its emissions compared to its GDP. It's a very substantial step forward. But rest of the world, the developed world, which has used the resources in the past and has contributed historically, I think they have to take higher targets to be able to see that the global emissions decline at a faster pace in the short term by 2030 rather than by 2050. That is the real challenge.
Right. The next question is from Sharvari. I hope, Sharvari, I'm getting your name right. But Sharvari, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, sir. Good evening. My question is how practical is the demand of reducing carbon emissions in a world where the African countries are still developing and would increasingly contribute to the total emissions in the future, even if the current major polluters say they meet their climate goals?
Well, if I have understood the question correctly, you are concerned about the rising pace of development or emissions in countries like Africa and the rest of the developing world. I think we should not be concerned. The contribution of the developing world to the global problem of climate change is extremely, I would say, it has been small, historically small. In future, it might grow. Countries like India and China and Brazil and South Africa, they might contribute more to the emissions in the future, but that is because their developmental needs are rising, just like Africa, which you have mentioned. And if you look at Africa, Africa contributes extremely small proportion, negligible to the global climate emissions profile. So we shouldn't be concerned about Africa's rising emissions or India's rising emissions. We need to establish a balance between the short-term goals and the long-term goals for the world as a whole. As we have discussed, the challenge before us is to ensure that we reduce our emissions proportionately to our resources and production in the developing world. But while the developed world reduces at a faster pace, uh, it must peak its emissions as fast as possible. Only a few of the 38 industrialized countries have actually peaked, and they have peaked only recently. They were supposed to have peaked in 1990. So they have lost almost 30 years. They must compensate for those lost 30 years and bring down their emissions at a much faster pace than what countries like India, Africa, and China can do.
Right. Uh, that takes us to our last question from the audience. Abhishek, please go ahead and ask your question.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir. My question is how the world is going to overcome the double standard approach of developed nations towards climate change and net zero targets. As on one side, they preach sustainable development, but on the other side, they are running behind non renewable sources for further development. Thank you, sir.
I think we have broadly covered this question in our
Yeah.
discussion earlier. That the net zero goal is a good goal. It's valid for the whole world. After all, we have to decarbonize over a longer period of time. So there is no problem with that. The question is that of the strategy and the feasibility. What kind of strategy we need to evolve? You have referred to the duplicity or the paradox. It's true. The kind of resources that need to come and the actions that need to be taken by our partners in the developed world, it hasn't materialized in that sense. So that is indeed a challenge. But hopefully, we are all working towards that goal together. And that is what the climate change conferences like the one that took place in Glasgow are aimed at, to promote international cooperation, build trust between the parties, and promote institutions and instruments that can help us move in that direction.
Right. Thank you. I'll quickly squeeze in one more question. I think we have time for one more. And I wanted to ask that: no, are we relying too much on technology in the future? Some futuristic technology to solve the climate problem for us. I mean, as we keep postponing more ambitious action to some later years. Are we somehow hoping for some breakthrough miraculous technology to come and help us out, even on the net zero, for example? I mean, carbon removal technologies, it depends heavily on the carbon removal technologies that are not entirely proven as of now. And even if technologically it's possible, it's not clear how economical they are going to be in the long run, especially for developing and poorer countries. So, by are we then putting too much uh, hope in the basket of technology, as yet unproven technologies?
Yes. The technology issue is an interesting question, is an interesting one. But I don't think it is impossible. Technologies in the future, of course, they are important. But I think the technologies that are currently available to us, they have also not been fully deployed. They have not been fully used. So that is a question. The carbon capture and storage technologies which you have referred to, they are technologies which will finally help us reach net zero.
Yeah.
Because the modeling of energy systems tells us that even after we use the best technologies that are available in terms of energy production or energy or transport emissions, or we reduce our emissions in different sectors, we will still be left with some residuals emissions in the economy, which we will not be able to completely neutralize. And it is for those kind of emissions that we will use or need to use carbon capture and storage technologies. But I'm not advocating that at all. I, for one, do not believe that we should go in that direction. What we should do is we should start moving towards alternative sources of energy with the help of technology that are currently available and technologies which might be available in the future. And those technologies are available to us. For example, energy efficiency is our large segment of our industries in India. They consist of small industries. They are currently using diesel and petrol and carbon and other sources of energy for meeting their energy needs. Why can't we bring them in a framework of energy efficiency improvement standards? Currently, we are aiming only the large industries. We should include them. So if we are able to fully utilize the energy efficiency technologies, I think we'll be able to bring down emissions very substantially. That is one. Transport sector is another sector where if we use electric mobility and green hydrogen, which is in the future, but it's all a question of producing these technologies at a commercial scale. Solar energy, 10 years ago, nobody thought that solar energy prices will fall to this extent. Today, the solar energy variable costs are lower than coal energy. They are at less than 3 rupees unit. And therefore, the solar capacity is now rising. So maybe in future, in about 10 years' time, the modeling shows that if the energy storage technologies improve, currently the solar energy that is being produced in the day, if we are able to store it in the night and meet the peak demand at a cost that is affordable, then I think we can achieve further emission reduction. But that is doable only if we are able to bring down the cost of the batteries. That may happen if we produce them at a commercial scale, at a large scale. Similar issue with the green hydrogen. It's costing almost $7 to $8 a ton. If we are able to bring down to less than $2, we could say that it will be comparable with that of solar and coal. Right. So it is possible. It's all a question of producing them at scale and bring them into the system, either with the help of regulation or with the help of involvement of energy and different stakeholders. They are not completely impossible technologies. The last point, which I'll come back to CCS, I think the alternative CCS to CCS is the use of land use technologies and the forests. We should invest in our forest sinks, the forests as carbon sinks, and also in the non-forest areas through agroforestry programs, so that we can sequester the carbon rather than using carbon capture and storage technologies, which are expensive.
Right. Thank you, sir. I think that brings us to the end of this discussion. Thank you for everyone who had joined in. I hope you found the discussion useful. I would also request you to keep following the explained pages of the Indian Express. You will find much more useful information coming in there. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Mr. Rashmi, for finding time for this session and answering all our questions. It was a very useful discussion, and a big thanks to our associate partner Yojana IAS, who decided to partner with us and made this interaction possible. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitabh. It was absolutely a pleasure talking to you, and my apologies for the small disruption that was caused.
That was not a problem. Not at all.
I hope you will be able to edit it.
Yes. Thank you. Right. Thanks.
Yojana IAS offering fresh batches for the year of 2022 and 2023. Yojana IAS has excellence journey of more than 20 years with highly qualified and experienced faculties, online interactive classes, mock tests, doubt classes, mock interviews, answer writing sessions. Yojana IAS offers a complete package for the UPSC aspirants. Yojana IAS के offline और online batches English और Hindi दोनों ही मीडियम में अवेलेबल हैं. So what are you waiting for? Go to to our website and register yourself now. Yojana IAS, offering fresh batches for the year of 2022 and 2023. Yojana IAS has excellence journey of more than 20 years with highly qualified and experienced faculties, online interactive classes, mock tests, doubt classes, mock interviews, answer writing sessions. Yojana IAS offers a complete package for the UPSC aspirants. योजना IAS के ऑफलाइन और ऑनलाइन बैचेस इंग्लिश और हिंदी दोनों ही मीडियम में अवेलेबल हैं. So what are you waiting for? Go to our website and register yourself now.